In the early 16th century, China was under the rule of the Ming Dynasty, one of the most powerful empires of its time. Among its emperors, Zhu Houzhao, known posthumously as the Zhengde Emperor, stood out for his eccentric rule and deviation from traditional governance. Born in 1491, he ascended the throne at the young age of 14, following the death of his father, the Hongji Emperor. Zhu Houzhao inherited a stable empire with a functioning bureaucracy, well-managed finances, and a disciplined army. However, unlike his predecessors, he showed little interest in the affairs of state. Instead, he preferred the pleasures of hunting, building palaces, and surrounding himself with entertainers and personal guards. The court soon became a place of indulgence rather than administration. His reign from 1505 to 1521 was marked by increasing neglect of governmental duties. Ministers often found it difficult to secure audiences with the emperor, as he frequently disguised himself to wander the streets of Beijing. Zhu Houzhao created private military expeditions and even formed his own elite unit known as the Leopard Corps, consisting of loyal soldiers and eunuchs who followed his personal commands. Despite his distractions, Zhu Houzhao maintained a strong influence over the empire's judicial and security systems. He allowed secret police units to operate with considerable autonomy, reporting directly to him. These units, known as the Eastern Depot and Western Depot, became infamous for their brutal interrogation methods. They served both as intelligence agencies and instruments of suppression against political rivals and accused traitors. The emperor's fascination with control and discipline grew as his trust in civil officials declined. He began relying on eunuchs, particularly Liu Jin, one of the most powerful figures of his court. Under Liu Jin's influence, a system of fear and obedience took hold. Reports indicate that interrogations were intensified, with confessions extracted through inventive and painful means. During this period, the use of salt in punishment and interrogation began to gain official recognition within certain imperial circles. Salt, already vital to the economy and a symbol of state control, took on a darker association. It was used not only as a preservative but also as an instrument of pain. Prisoners accused of corruption, espionage, or treason were subjected to methods designed to prolong suffering while avoiding immediate death. Zhu Houzhao's administration, though inconsistent, achieved limited military successes. His campaigns in the north and west against Mongol incursions showcased his adventurous nature. However, his absence from governance allowed corruption to flourish within the bureaucracy. Eunuchs and regional officials used the emperor's name to justify their own excesses. The common people bore the burden of higher taxes and arbitrary punishment. Within the Forbidden City, reports describe how the emperor transformed sections of the palace into zones of entertainment and training. Wild animals were kept in enclosures for hunting practice, and performances were staged nightly. Yet behind this facade of leisure, political prisoners were often held in hidden chambers beneath the imperial compound. Some of these chambers later became associated with the earlier counts of the salt tortures. The emperor's relationship with the scholar official class deteriorated rapidly. Traditional Confucian advisors criticized his behavior and his reliance on eunuchs, which they viewed as a corruption of moral governance. In response, Zhu Houzhao dismissed many officials and replaced them with loyal followers who tolerated his unconventional rule. This shift weakened the administrative integrity of the Ming government. Despite his reputation for indifference, Zhu Houzhao remained deeply curious about matters of medicine, alchemy, and the human body. Historical documents suggest he sponsored experiments on prisoners, particularly in methods of bodily preservation and endurance under pain. These interests would later intertwine with the use of salt as a means to test both human resistance and the limits of physical suffering. By 1515, his court was divided between reformists seeking to restore order and loyalists exploiting imperial favor. The emperor, indifferent to the political struggle, continued his expeditions, including one to Jiangxi and another to Nanjing, where he indulged in lavish processions. These journeys were often funded through the forced contributions of local provinces. Dissidents and rebels who opposed his collection orders were publicly punished to deter further unrest. Within the empire, the emperor's reliance on punitive deterrence became evident. Public executions, branding, and corporal punishments were used to enforce obedience. The use of salt in these punishments evolved from common torture practices used by local officials. Wounds were salted to prevent rapid death, forcing prisoners to endure extended pain as a warning to others. The emperor's neglect of moral leadership gradually reshaped the cultural tone of his reign. Fear became an administrative tool. Eunuchs, empowered by imperial decree, often used salt-based tortures during interrogations to extract confessions swiftly. The method required minimal equipment, making it both efficient and terrifying in its simplicity. Zhu Houzhao's reign reflected the contradictions of his personality: extravagant yet inquisitive, careless yet commanding. His palace grew into a center of both pleasure and punishment. While he delighted in constructing artificial lakes and amusement halls, the lower chambers of his court became symbols of imperial cruelty. It was within this duality that the salt tortures gained permanence as a recognized method of imperial discipline. Foreign envoys who visited the Ming court recorded impressions of an emperor who was both charming and unpredictable. They admired the grandeur of the empire, but noted its underlying instability. The imperial administration operated under strict secrecy, with punishments delivered swiftly to those accused of leaking information. The empire, outwardly strong, began to exhibit cracks beneath the surface of control. The emperor's later years were marked by growing isolation. His trusted eunuchs controlled much of the communication between him and the outside world. Reports of torture, confiscation of property, and suppression of dissent became more frequent. The salt tortures, initially experimental, evolved into a systematic approach within the prison network of the capital. Although Zhu Houzhao saw himself as an enlightened ruler interested in innovation and order, his actions revealed a misunderstanding of governance. His detachment from administrative responsibility allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. Torture, particularly involving salt, became not merely a method of interrogation, but a reflection of imperial authority itself, an assertion of control through calculated pain. By the final years of his reign, the emperor had become a figure of contradiction in historical memory. To his supporters, he was an adventurous spirit who defied rigid traditions. To his critics, he was a ruler whose indifference to governance allowed human suffering to become institutionalized. The empire he inherited remained intact, but beneath the splendor of Beijing's walls, the foundations of fear had already been laid. As the Ming Dynasty moved forward, the influence of Zhu Houzhao's reign persisted in the methods and mentality of imperial enforcement. The salt tortures, originating during his administration, would later become a grim reminder of how unchecked curiosity and power could transform a natural element into an instrument of prolonged suffering. Quick reminder: if you are enjoying, do like the video and subscribe the channel for upcoming historical torture content. Under the rule of Emperor Zhu Houzhao, the Ming penal system evolved into a complex network of prisons, interrogation centers, and secret chambers overseen by eunuch officials. The emperor's detachment from direct governance allowed these enforcers to experiment freely with new methods of punishment. Among the various techniques used to extract information or enforce loyalty, the application of salt to open wounds became one of the most feared and effective. The salt torture was simple in design, yet precise in its cruelty. Prisoners accused of treason, espionage, or tax evasion were often beaten first to expose the skin. Once the flesh was torn or cut, handfuls of coarse salt or cloth soaked in brine were rubbed into the wounds. The salt immediately inflamed the exposed tissue, producing a burning sensation that persisted for hours. The victims' cries were often recorded as proof of confession, their endurance used to measure guilt. Officials in the Eastern Depot, the Emperor's secret police bureau, maintained strict documentation of interrogation results. Each session was logged, including the time it took for a prisoner to confess. Those who endured longer without speaking were often subjected to repeated applications, with wounds reopened daily. The idea was not immediate death, but gradual exhaustion, ensuring the body broke before the spirit did. Historical reports describe that salt was favored for both symbolic and practical reasons. It represented purity, preservation, and control, qualities associated with imperial order. The same substance that preserved food for the empire's soldiers was used to preserve pain in the bodies of its prisoners. Salt also prevented infection in early stages, allowing interrogators to prolong suffering over several days without killing the victim too quickly. Witness accounts from the late Ming period mention that brine-filled basins were kept in interrogation chambers. Prisoners were sometimes lowered into these basins after being cut across the back or chest. The solution, made of concentrated sea salt, caused intense stinging as it entered every open wound. Guards recorded reactions to determine levels of endurance, sometimes increasing the salinity for subsequent sessions. In cases of political dissent, where confessions were deemed essential for suppressing uprisings, the salt torture was performed in public. Small towns and villages occasionally witnessed punishments carried out before crowds to instill fear. Offenders' wounds were rubbed with salt by local magistrates, followed by forced exposure to the sun to intensify the burning sensation. The mingling of pain and spectacle reinforced the emperor's authority over both body and mind. The technique also served as a means of communication between officials. Reports detailing the use of salt were exchanged as proof of diligence in interrogation. Efficiency in extracting information was seen as loyalty to the throne. Eunuchs in charge of prisons gained influence through their mastery of these methods, often competing for imperial favor by demonstrating effective control over prisoners. The salt torture was not limited to political enemies. Common criminals, debtors, and soldiers accused of cowardice were also subjected to variations of the punishment. In military garrisons, deserters were tied to wooden posts and whipped before salt water was poured over their wounds. This practice was intended to deter others from fleeing the battlefield. The military viewed pain as discipline and salt as its unyielding teacher. Medical records from the Ming court's physicians provide indirect evidence of the torture's physical effects. Victims suffered dehydration, muscle spasms, and eventual shock from continuous exposure to salt. The tissue around wounds often hardened, preventing healing and causing immense stiffness in limbs. In severe cases, salt caused systemic infection through prolonged exposure, leading to organ failure days after interrogation. The philosophical justification for such practices rested on the Confucian ideal of maintaining order through moral correction. Ming scholars argued that pain could restore virtue in those who had strayed. Officials described the salt torture as a method of purification, cleansing the corruption within the human body and returning the individual to a state of submission before death or release. In some records, prisoners were given the choice between confession under salt torture or death by execution. Many chose execution. The process of salting wounds, especially when combined with other methods such as bamboo splinters under fingernails or iron weights on the chest, was known to last for days. Guards were instructed to keep victims alive long enough to complete written confessions or name accomplices. Eunuchs overseeing these punishments gained reputations that extended beyond the palace walls. Figures such as Liu Jin were both feared and respected for their command of the interrogation system. They viewed the extraction of truth through suffering as an art, refining the application of salt to ensure maximum compliance. Some even devised techniques where prisoners' limbs were bound in salt-soaked ropes, causing burning sensations that lasted through the night. The imperial archives, though heavily censored, mention certain cleansing chambers beneath the capital where prisoners were kept under salted conditions for extended periods. The air itself was said to sting from the concentration of salt vapors. Prisoners would emerge barely conscious, their skin cracked and their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Few survived long enough to stand trial. The salt trade, one of the empire's main sources of revenue, indirectly supported these practices. The same routes that supplied salt for preservation and commerce also delivered it to prisons across the provinces. This connection between economic necessity and physical punishment became deeply embedded in Ming administration. Salt, both sustainer and destroyer, symbolized the empire's capacity to control life and death. During large-scale crackdowns on suspected rebels, the torture chambers were filled for weeks. Interrogators worked in shifts, ensuring that no prisoner was left unattended for more than an hour. Salt barrels lined the walls, replenished daily from nearby markets. Prisoners were often forced to witness the suffering of others before undergoing the same fate, reinforcing psychological submission. The empire's reliance on torture for confessions led to widespread fear within the bureaucracy. Officials hesitated to oppose policies or question imperial orders. A single accusation of disloyalty could result in imprisonment and the salt treatment. The courts of justice, once rooted in Confucian ideals of fairness, had transformed into arenas of endurance. Foreign envoys who visited China during this period rarely witnessed such punishments directly, but rumors spread through trade networks. Merchants returning from coastal ports reported stories of prisoners with salted wounds walking unsteadily through city streets as living warnings. These accounts contributed to the growing reputation of the Ming legal system as both efficient and merciless. The combination of salt, discipline, and imperial authority created an enduring image of controlled suffering. The emperor's fascination with human endurance translated into administrative policy. His subordinates, seeking to demonstrate loyalty, carried out these practices with precision. The salt torture, though initially used for confessions, gradually became a symbol of order, an embodiment of the belief that fear preserved stability. By the end of Zhu Houzhao's reign, the salt torture had spread beyond the capital. Provincial governors and military officers incorporated it into their disciplinary codes. The practice persisted long after the emperor's death, integrated into the legal culture of the Ming Dynasty as a legacy of his governance. What had begun as an experiment in pain through preservation became a structured tool of state control, leaving behind a record of suffering that reflected the darker dimensions of imperial authority. By the final years of Zhu Houzhao's reign, the Ming court was burdened by corruption, rebellion, and declining public trust. The emperor's detachment from governance had weakened central authority, allowing eunuchs and military commanders to exercise unchecked power. The salt tortures, once limited to interrogation chambers, had become routine instruments of discipline within both the civil and military systems. As reports of cruelty reached the provinces, resentment spread among scholars and officials. Confucian administrators condemned the excesses carried out in the emperor's name. They viewed the salt tortures as signs of moral decay, a perversion of justice under a ruler more fascinated by control than compassion. Secret petitions were sent to the imperial censorate urging reform, though few reached the throne. In 1519, the emperor's personal campaign against rebellious forces in Jiangxi exposed the fragility of his authority. Soldiers, fearful of punishment, followed orders under threat rather than loyalty. Desertions increased, and discipline was maintained through public displays of salt-based torture. These scenes, once symbols of imperial strength, began to represent a government sustained by fear rather than legitimacy. Illness and isolation soon consumed the emperor. Contemporary accounts suggest that years of indulgence, combined with stress and exposure during military expeditions, weakened his health. In 1521, Zhu Houzhao died at the age of 30, leaving no heir. His sudden death marked the end of a turbulent chapter in Ming history. The court moved quickly to erase traces of his more controversial practices, including the official endorsement of the salt tortures. However, the damage had already been done. The system he left behind continued to operate under subsequent emperors. Eunuchs retained control of interrogation centers, and salt remained a favored instrument due to its availability and effectiveness. Provincial officials, trained under Zhu Houzhao's regime, perpetuated the method as part of standard legal procedure. The line between justice and cruelty had become permanently blurred. Records from later dynasties reference the brine rooms of the Ming period as examples of state excess. Philosophers and historians debated whether the emperor's interest in salt and preservation was scientific curiosity or an expression of unchecked power. To the common people, the memory of salted wounds and forced confessions became a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial neglect. By the late Ming era, reformers attempted to re-establish humane legal standards, yet the fear embedded by Zhu Houzhao's policies lingered. His reign became synonymous with misplaced authority, a time when natural elements like salt were turned into instruments of endurance and obedience. The salt tortures of China endured not as a single emperor's creation, but as a reflection of how power, when unrestrained, transforms necessity into suffering. Through the reign of Zhu Houzhao, the Ming Dynasty revealed that preservation could coexist with pain, and that control achieved through agony was as fragile as the ruler who commanded it.